Good evening. Today, the story that will haunt your thoughts until sleep arrives is called Susanoo and the Eight-Headed Serpent. It is an ancient tale full of wind, anger, fear, and a little sag. If you like what I do here, you can subscribe. That's it. No rush. Now, before we dive into the silence of ancient Japan, turn off the lights, adjust the pillow, maybe turn on a fan, just that constant sound in the background, and, if you can, put your cell phone aside. You don't have to watch. Just listen, and let your mind draw the images. The story will take care of the rest. It all starts with a noise no one would like to hear. The fall of a god. It's not the kind of fall that makes a noise from a body. It's more like an absence of sound, a suspension, a pause in the sky. Susanoo, the god of storms, wasn't just thrown out, he was rejected, expelled by Amaterasu, his sister, the goddess of the sun, after yet another of his thoughtless actions. They hadn't gotten along for a long time. He was thunder, she, light. He was impatience, she, control. And at that point, he didn't know if he wanted to ask for forgiveness or break everything. The crossing from heaven to earth was not grand. Susanoo did not fall with glory. He fell with a kind of silent rage. He touched the ground like someone who did not want to be there. The wind that followed him got caught in the trees. The heavy clouds that enveloped him slowly dissipated, and he just walked, a god without an altar, without a purpose, with his arrogance undone, and his feet dirty with mud. Japan was still a place of long pauses and dense forests. Nothing like now. There was the smell of raw wood, the sound of a river running slowly, and a kind of emptiness that echoed inside the chest. It was as he walked aimlessly that he heard something, a sob, discreet, restrained, like the sound of an old wound being touched. At the edge of a river, a man knelt down, holding a thin wooden staff so tightly that his knuckles were white. Beside him, a woman stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if there were nothing left to see. And between them, a young woman with her body erect, but her soul leaning back. Her eyes looked at the river, but they didn't see the water. They saw the end. It was Kushinada Jaime. Susanoo did not approach like a god. He approached like someone who was tired of himself. He asked, and the answer came in pieces. Yamata no Orochi, an immense serpent with 8 heads and 8 tails that descends from the north like a dirty mist. Every year, it demands a daughter. It has already taken 7. Only Kushinada remains, the last one, the one who was supposed to die that night. The father spoke with the voice of someone who had lost everything, except the obligation to keep breathing. The mother spoke little, enough to hurt. Kushinada, for her part, did not speak. She had already said goodbye inside. Susanoo stood still for a few moments. He saw a scene there that did not belong to him, and yet, he offered. He said he could defeat the creature, and that, if he did, he would take Kushinada as his wife. The silence that followed the proposal was not one of shock. It was the silence of someone who is trying to believe in anything. The mother looked at her daughter. The father closed his eyes. Kushinada just waited. There was no more time for hope, only for luck. And perhaps Susanoo was exactly that, a god of luck, or of last chance. He then left, without warning, with a heavy mind and determined feet. He did not yet know how he would do it. He only knew that he would do it. And for some reason, that night seemed colder than all the others. The wind blew strangely, as if it were carrying something very ancient, and the serpent was already on its way. Susanoo walked slowly, without looking back. His face bore the expression of someone who had fought too much with the world and now just wanted to find something that made sense. He was not a hero. He never had been. But at that moment, Something inside him, perhaps pride, perhaps tiredness, told him that facing that serpent was inevitable, not as a challenge, but as an answer. The village of Izumo seemed too small for the fear it carried. The wooden houses creaked. Even without wind, the roofs were low, as if people were trying to hide from the sky. It was night, but not an ordinary night. There was a dense silence, which did not come from peace, but from expectation. A held breath shared by everyone. Even the dogs, which always barked for no reason, were quiet. Susanoo stopped near an ancient tree. He touched the trunk with his dust-stained fingers. He thought, what moves a god who has lost everything? What remains after exile? Anger? Shame? Perhaps, he thought, the only way is to do something that no one expects. Something that doesn't involve destruction. Something that involves protecting. Not that he knew exactly how, but Yamata no Orochi wasn't just a monster. It was a ritual, a certainty, a reminder to that village that every year someone must disappear. Susanoo wanted to break that. With day almost breaking, he returned to the couple's house. The old man was still awake. So was his mother. There was no more sleep in that place. Waking up early was just a way to die slowly. Kushinada remained silent, sitting by the door, her gaze fixed on something that only she could see. When Susanoo entered, no one moved. He explained his plan in a few words. There was no time for speeches. He said he would build a trap. He said he would need sake, lots of sake, and large wooden vats. The old man nodded. He didn't question it. During the day, Susanoo worked as he had not done in a long time. He chopped wood. He dug holes. He built structures. Each platform was made to support a large, heavy vat, strong enough not to tip over when a snake's head sank into it. The sake would be strong, fermented for days and days, saved for occasions that never came. Now it would be used as bait. It was simple, almost ridiculous. But Susanoo trusted his instincts, and perhaps a little luck. Kushinada watched. Sometimes he would come closer. Without saying anything, he would bring water, adjust a rope, stretch a cloth. He noticed, but he did not speak. There was a kind of silent understanding between them. Neither of them had any control over what was to come. They just did what they could. When night fell again, the stage was set. The field in front of the village now had 8 platforms, lined up in a semicircle, each filled to the brim with a vat of sake. The smell was strong, warm, almost sweet. The old man looked at it with moist eyes. His mother, from afar, was praying, not out of faith, but out of desperation. Kushinada, for the first time, asked something. What if it doesn't work? Susanoo didn't answer right away. He just said, if it doesn't work, no one will be here to remember. And that, in a way, was a relief. The wind changed at that moment. It grew denser, wetter. It was as if the air knew what was coming. The first vibration in the ground was almost imperceptible, a gentle tremor. Then the birds suddenly fell silent, and then, deep in the forest, the sound, a low, wet growl that seemed to come from all sides at once. Night was ready, and Yamata no Orochi was coming. The ground vibrated in a slow, irregular rhythm, like the heart of someone about to make a decision with no turning back. It wasn't an earthquake, nor was it an ordinary animal. It was a presence. Yamata no Orochi announced itself before it could be seen. A kind of shadow that began on the ground and climbed up the wooden columns, up the legs, up the shoulders. The trees in the background didn't move with the wind. They bent, as if they remembered, as if they feared. Susanoo remained silent. His eyes followed the movement of the horizon, but his body was firm. He had seen many things, but this was different. It was as if the serpent carried with it the very concept of fear, not a violent fear, but a fear that slowly creeps in, that sits beside him and whispers, "Today is your turn." The first head appeared from the bushes, through the mist that formed naturally, but seemed calculated. Gigantic, scaly, its eyes red as embers, its tongue split in two, and dripping thick, dark saliva. Then came the second and the third, until all 8 were there, rising slowly, like wet towers, undulating in the heavy air. There were no screams, not from the village, not from the creature, only the sound of its own body dragging itself, a noise like stone being scraped with metal. The serpent looked around with multiple eyes. Each head seemed to have its own will, and they all seemed hungry, not for food, but for continuity. It did not eat to live, it lived to eat. The cycle was its fuel. The repetition of sacrifice was what kept it going. The sake vats were exactly where Susanoo had placed them. A light breeze carried the alcoholic scent to the creatures' noses. They hesitated for a second. Their necks wavered in the air, and then, one by one, they began to move toward the drink, unhurriedly, as if they recognized the ritual, as if they knew that this was the right time. The first head sank into the liquid with a viscous sound. The second did the same, and in a few moments, all 8 were immersed up to their eyes. The noise that could be heard now was of long gulps, deep swallows, heavy breathing. It was a macabre drunkenness. The serpent was being intoxicated by its own desire. Susanoo watched, still without moving. Every muscle in his body waited for the exact moment. There was no glory in it, only precision. The heads began to move more slowly. The fourth one tilted a little to the side. The sixth one sank too low, as if it had forgotten it needed to breathe. The sake was taking effect. One by one, the red eyes lost focus. The internal roaring began to fade. The gigantic body went limp. Susanoo then walked, not with fury, but with determination. The sword he carried had no name yet. It was not a relic. It was just a sharp, heavy blade. He climbed onto one of the platforms. The closest head was still breathing, trying to understand where it was. He cut it off with a clean movement. Fast. Blood came out like hot steam. The serpent shuddered, but did not rise. The second came soon after. Another severed head. Another gush of blood. The others began to stir. Slowly. But the alcohol pulled them back into their stupor. The third tried to get up, but fell to the side. Susanoo didn't hesitate. One cut, one more. It was like cutting down thick trees, only with eyes. Eyes that looked right at him. The fourth and fifth came together. The sixth tried to bite, but missed the target and hit its own tail. They were uncoordinated, drunk, but still dangerous. The fight became a tense dance between the creature's strength and the god's precision. Susanoo moved coldly. His body was sweating. His face was stained with blood, but his eyes remained fixed. Nothing there was easy. No death was easy. Each blow was a physical and emotional effort. It was like facing one's own repetition, one's own punishment. The seventh head fell with a hoarse groan. The last one hesitated. It was the largest, and even drunk, it seemed to understand what was happening. It let out a roar that tore through the night. It tried to retreat. It tried to fight, but it was too late. Susanoo faced it head on, and with a blow heavier than the previous ones, it cut off the last head of the serpent. The last roar dissolved into the air like steam on hot stone. The head fell with a weight that made the earth tremble slightly. Then, nothing. No sound. No vibration. The field fell silent. A thick, uncomfortable silence. It wasn't the triumphant end of a battle. It was the strange emptiness that comes right after, when everything stops moving and you don't know whether to breathe faster or stop altogether. Susanoo stood among the bodies. Blood still dripped down the wooden platforms. mixed with the remaining sake. The smell was strong, bittersweet, almost nauseating. The serpent's body, stretched out like a distorted river, took up the entire field. The sky was beginning to lighten, but not in a hurry. The morning light seemed hesitant, as if it didn't want to interrupt this moment. The god did not smile. He did not raise his arms. He simply lowered his sword. He was tired, not like someone who had run a marathon, but like someone who had carried something invisible for too long. What he had killed was not just a monster. It was the repetition of fear. It was the certainty of mourning. It was the memory of 7 daughters who would never return. The serpent was dead, but nothing would ever be the same again. He took a deep breath. He looked around. No sign of the village. No one had come to watch. It was understandable. Who in their right mind would watch a creature with 8 heads being sacrificed in the middle of the night? What if it went wrong? Being a witness to that was perhaps an even greater burden than living in the shadow of the monster. So, he was alone. He and the immense body that writhed slowly in a last involuntary spasm, driven by an ancient intuition. Susanoo approached what remained of the 8th head, the most resistant, the fiercest, the one that fought until the end. Its body still pulsed discreetly, as if it refused to admit its own death. The tail, thick as a tree trunk, was open by one of the wounds, and inside it, something shone. It wasn't flesh. It wasn't bone. It was metal. Susanoo frowned. He crouched down. He reached into the clotted blood and pulled slowly. The object resisted a little, but then came out. It was a sword, thin, long, with a dark substance covering the blade. Yet there was beauty to it. The blade seemed alive, as if it had waited a long time for this moment. He held it carefully. It was no ordinary weapon. It had the weight of a memory, of purpose, of something that was not his, but that chose him at that moment. Susanoo observed it in silence for long minutes. He felt no pride, no glory, only a strange connection. The sword was the fruit of violence. Yes, but it was also a relic. It was present. It was future. He did not know it yet, but later he would give this sword to his sister, Amaterasu, and it would become one of the 3 sacred treasures of Japan. But for now, it was just a symbol that something had been conquered and something had been left behind. The sky was now really beginning to lighten. The blue was slowly emerging, shyly, as if it wanted to ask permission from the night. The field was still stained, but the air seemed lighter. The trees were straightening up. The birds were slowly starting to sing again. Susanoo walked back to the couple's house, unhurriedly. Each step was like a transition between worlds, from chaos to calm, from noise to pause. When he arrived, he saw the old man waiting at the entrance. His eyes were red, his body hunched over. Beside him, his mother, her hands clasped together, unsure of what to do with them. And Kushinada, she was standing, still there, still alive, and for a brief moment, a smile almost appeared at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't joy. It was relief. It was the kind of smile that appears when death has strayed from the path. Susanoo said nothing. He didn't expect any words either. He just looked at those 3 and let his body fall lightly, sitting on the ground, his dirty hands resting on his knees. He was exhausted, but within the tiredness, there was a strange peace, not because he had won, but because he had done something that mattered. The village didn't know it yet. The world didn't know it yet, but Yamata no Orochi was dead, and Susanoo, perhaps he was alive for the first time in a long time. Kushinada still hadn't moved. He was still standing there, his bare feet touching the cold floor of the balcony. His hair was disheveled from a bad night's sleep. His face was bare, expressionless. Only his gaze was different, not of gratitude, nor of hope. It was a gaze that carried the weight of someone who had survived something he shouldn't have survived. and that, in itself, was already a lot. Susanoo watched her without meaning to. He just let his eyes rest there. She, in turn, did not look away. There was no fear, there was also no fascination. It was as if they were seeing each other for the first time, without the veil of divine office, without the obligation to appear strong or innocent, just two people who had been too close to the end. The father took a deep breath. He let out a sigh that seemed to contain years of accumulated sadness. The mother still kept her hands clasped together, as if releasing her fingers would bring back the chaos. Neither of them spoke. There was no need to. The silence of that moment said it all. 7 dead daughters, one alive, and a strange god sitting on the floor, with dried blood on his arms. Susanoo stood up slowly. He was tired, but in one piece. He didn't feel proud of what he had done, but he didn't regret it either. It was the kind of action that can't be measured with words. It can only be accepted. He walked towards Kusinada. He stopped at a respectful distance. He didn't extend his hand. He simply said in a low voice, "You won't have to run away anymore." She nodded. Just once, like someone hearing an ancient truth, like someone hearing something they had been waiting for, but never thought would come. And then, without ceremony, she went back into the house, not out of disdain, but because now she could. The threat was gone. Ordinary life, or something like it, could perhaps begin. Susanoo stood still for a while, watching the door slowly close. The simple gesture of a young woman entering the house seemed at that moment more powerful than any sword or thunder. He knew what he had said before, that he would take Kusinada as his wife. But here, on that gray morning, that no longer seemed so clear, nor urgent, nor necessary. Perhaps it would be better to let time speak first. The day progressed slowly. The news spread through the village, little by little, like a breeze across the rooftops. Some villagers approached the field, saw the huge bodies of the serpent, and ran back in silence. Others stared for a while, as if they still couldn't believe it. No one dared to touch anything. It was like looking into a bad dream that had finally ended. Susanoo spent the afternoon in silence. He cleaned his sword. He washed his hands in the river. He watched the bodies being slowly consumed by time and flies. He asked for no laurels or honors. He stayed close, but never in the center. And for some reason, that was enough. Kusinada also remained silent. She helped her mother with small tasks. She brewed tea. She hung clothes in the sun. She walked with the light steps, as if she were still testing the ground. In the evening, she sat on the porch with her father. Neither of them spoke about what had happened, but their hands touched for a few seconds, and that was enough. On the second day, Susanoo returned to the field. The platforms were still there, stained with dried blood and scraps of wood, but there was something that still disturbed him. It wasn't fear or regret. It was a kind of need, something he himself didn't quite understand. He walked to the spot where he found the sword, deep inside the tail. He stopped, he looked, and then, almost without thinking, he began to clear the space around it. He removed branches, pushed rocks. He didn't know why. He just knew that he wanted to do it. And as he cleaned, he began to imagine a place, a small, tall, simple space, a wooden structure with windows open to the wind, a place that was neither a castle nor a temple, just shelter, a refuge for someone who had lived too long, exposed to the sky and the fury of others. On the third day, he began to build. With his own hands, he took wood from nearby trees. He used improvised ropes and stones as a base. Kusinada showed up late in the morning. He watched. He didn't ask anything. He just placed a bowl of rice next to him and left. The next day, he brought water. The day after that, straw strands. They never said they were building together, but they were. And so, little by little, stone by stone, silence by silence, What would one day be called the Sugar Palace began to be born there. Susanoo was never an architect. He was not a craftsman. He did not know the names of the techniques, the fittings, or the correct proportions, but he knew emptiness. He knew what it was like to need a corner of his own, where the world does not shout and the past does not demand anything. So he built with instinct, like someone who plants something in the ground just to see it grow, like someone who wants to stay for the first time. The chosen spot was a little away from the village, on a small hill where the wind blew calmly and the sun shone just enough in the morning. From up there, one could see the field where Yamata no Orochi had fallen. But the view was serene, a reminder that the violence had ended, that even the monsters, one day, would stop coming back. Kushinada didn't ask what he was doing. She only showed up sometimes, left food, carried a bundle of straw, fixed part of the roof. What was growing between them wasn't a romance from old stories. It was something more practical, more subtle, a kind of unnamed care. She didn't smile easily, but she stayed, and that said much more than any words. The construction took days, then weeks, not because it was large, but because it was done by hands that were not in a hurry. The roof was sloping, covered with thick leaves, and tied with vines. The walls left open spaces for the wind to pass through. There was no luxury, no ornamentation, just wood, stone, and silence. That was enough. Late one afternoon, Susanoo sat in the doorway of the house. The wood still smelled fresh. His hands were cut, but steady. He looked around and, for a moment, thought that perhaps he was closer to something he could never name. It wasn't glory, nor redemption. Perhaps it was rest. Kushinada arrived shortly after. She was carrying a small basket with warm tea and rice wrapped in leaves. She sat down next to him, without invitation, without ceremony, and they stayed there, just listening to the sounds of the wind, the moving of the grass, the sky closing in shades of dark blue. It was she who spoke first, after a long time. "Are you going to stay here?" The question was simple, but it was loaded, as if, deep down, she was asking, "Are you going to run away again? Are you going to get tired? Are you going to disappear like the gods do?" Susanoo did not answer immediately. He picked up the teacup. He drank slowly. And then he said, in a low voice, "I think so. At least, for now." She nodded. Not enthusiastically, but with something close to acceptance. Perhaps that was what they both knew best, accepting what is without demanding what cannot be. In the village, Susanoo's presence was still being watched carefully. Some thanked him silently. Others avoided eye contact. They didn't quite know what to make of a god of flesh and blood, a god who got dirty, who built his own house, who didn't give orders or perform miracles. To many, he seemed more like a stranger than a savior, and that made him feel more at ease. Little by little, he and Kushinada established a routine, simple, almost invisible. They woke up early. They prepared food. They took care of the space. Sometimes they walked together in the fields. Sometimes they remained silent for hours. They didn't need to say they were married. They were. Not by ceremony, but by choice, by coexistence, by survival. Susanoo began to speak less, not out of sadness, but because he felt less need to explain himself, and Kushinada, who had never been one for many words, found in him a peaceful mirror, a home built on the inside, not just the outside. The palace was not a symbol of power. It was just a place where the two of them could exist without the weight of what came before. Time passed differently there. No dates, no achievements, just the seasons changing the color of the leaves, the sound of the wind changing direction, the temperature of the earth underfoot. And it was like that, without fanfare, that Sugar Palace became part of the landscape, as if it had always been there, as if it were inevitable. And in that simple building, born of remains, weariness, and silence, there was something rare, something that no temple in heaven could offer Susanoo, a home. Not because it was his, but because someone chose to stay there with him, perched on the hill. Sugar Palace didn't look like a palace, or a temple, or a house of God. It was a modest structure, made of irregular wood, built without a map. But if you looked closely, you would see that there was something there that couldn't be measured with your eyes. Something invisible, but present. A kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was rest. The surrounding field grew slowly. The earth still resembled the snake's blood, but vegetation was beginning to take over. The marks of the fight were there, but less obvious. It was as if nature, little by little, wanted to cover the tragedy with moss, leaves, and time. Nothing completely erases it, but everything softens. Eventually, Susanoo was no longer the same man who had fallen from the sky. He had calluses on his hands, sun marks on his face, and a tiredness that did not come from anger, but from constant work. He would wake up early, gather firewood, adjust details of the house, sit on the edge of the woods, and just stare. It was hard to know what he was thinking. Maybe he didn't even know. He only knew that he didn't want to leave. Not yet. Kushinada walked more lightly. He didn't smile much, but he no longer carried the stiffness of waiting. She was literally planting roots. She began to tend a small vegetable garden in the back of the house. Simple herbs, garlic, ginger, a little rice, nothing special, but everything was done with intention. Sometimes he would sing softly while he watered, and even if no one was supposed to hear, Susanoo listened. Always, they spoke little, not for lack of things to say, but because the silence between them was comfortable. A type of language that needed no explanation. A cup left ready, clothes hung out before the rain, wood put on the fire before the other person asked. Small gestures that said, "I am here," and that was enough. The village began to change over time, not explicitly, but in subtle ways. The market once again operated peacefully. Children played without looking back. Adults walked less hunched over. And although many still avoided looking directly at Susanoo when he came down to fetch salt or fish, there was a restrained respect, a wordless recognition. There were those who thought it strange that this god lived among them, a god who did not give blessings nor make it rain, a god who walked barefoot with his hair tied up in a mess and carried firewood on his back. But there were also those who felt relief in knowing that if fear returned, someone like him would be there, not above, but beside. One afternoon, while harvesting herbs, Kushinada found a small injured bird near the entrance to the house. She didn't say anything. She picked it up carefully, carried it to a basket lined with cloth, and placed it in a quiet corner. Susanoo saw it from afar. She didn't come closer. She just watched the gesture, the delicacy, the time it took her to wet the bird's beak, to arrange its feathers. The next day, the bird was still breathing, weak, but alive. On the third day, it tried to take off. It fell again. On the fifth day, it managed to fly a few meters. It disappeared among the trees. Neither of them commented, but that evening, Susanoo served the tea more carefully, and Kushinada put extra wood on the fire without looking, without needing to say anything. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't sadness either. It was something in between. A state of quiet presence. A way of living that requires no endings or beginnings. Just continuity, survival, and who knows, one day, permanence. That night, it rained. Not much, just enough to make the sound on the wooden roof sound like a distant drum. The wind whistled through the half-open windows, And inside the house, the two sat side by side, each with his own bowl. Outside, the world went on. But inside, for a few hours, nothing else was needed. Susanoo looked outside. The rain dripped down like a reminder. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't miss the sky, or the glory, or the war. He just stayed, and in that staying, there was a peace that not even the gods knew well. Time on the hilltop did not follow human calendars. It was measured by more subtle things: the growth of leaves, the change in wind direction, the sound of footsteps on wet earth. To those outside, Sugar Palace seemed frozen in time, but those inside knew that everything was moving. Even if slowly, Susanoo continued with his tasks. He carried wood, reinforced the roof, cut grass with exaggerated precision, as if this helped him maintain control. But sometimes, when no one was looking, he would stop in the middle of a simple gesture, as if he had forgotten for a second where he was, and he would just stand there, with his eyes lost in some point. There was something inside him that wouldn't budge, something old. It wasn't guilt or anger, it was something else, something with no name, maybe a void, maybe an echo. He had faced an 8-headed serpent, saved a village, found a woman who didn't fear him. But still, there were nights when his body felt too heavy to stand. Kushinada noticed. She didn't comment. She just approached with a damp cloth, a warm bowl, a touch on the shoulder. That was enough. She also knew what it was like to carry absences. She knew that certain silences can't be broken. They can only be accompanied, and that's what she did. She stayed close. One morning, Susanoo woke before the sun. He left his house without making a sound. He walked down the misty hillside. He passed the field where the serpent had died. The grass had almost covered it, but he still knew exactly where each head had fallen, where the blood had run thickest, where the sword had met resistance. He stopped there. He took a deep breath. He sat down on the ground. He grabbed a handful of soil. He looked at the grains between his fingers. He thought about the sky, his sister, Amaterasu. He thought about how everything had started because of her, or rather, because of what he couldn't be around her. The annoying brother, the one who didn't know how to measure words, the one who challenged just so he wouldn't feel inferior. The memory of exile still burned, even there, so far from everything. But now, with his body dirty from the ground and his heart calmer, he realized something else. That maybe he had never been a god of great deeds. Maybe he was just a god who makes mistakes, who tries, who pretends not to care. But he does. And now, he's tired of running away. Kushinada found him there sometime later. He didn't ask anything. He sat down next to him. He also picked up a handful of dirt. They stayed like that for a while, like two travelers who had forgotten their destination, like two survivors who finally didn't need to run. Later, when they returned, Susanoo stood in front of the palace. He observed it carefully. He saw the simple details: the sloping roof, the reinforced ropes, the carefully hung cloths, and something inside him tightened, an old fear that this would be ephemeral, that this peace would not last, that the world, sooner or later, would remember that he was a god and not an ordinary man. That night, to the sound of the strong wind, Susanoo had a strange dream. He was in the sky again, in front of Amaterasu, but she didn't look at him with anger, nor with sadness, only with a kind of tired curiosity, like someone who sees someone come back different. He tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out, only the sound of rain. He woke up with his chest tight, his hands sweaty. The fire still burned low in the center of the house. Kushinada was asleep. He looked at her for a few seconds. Then he closed his eyes again. He tried to sleep, but he couldn't. He stood up. He went outside. The sky was clear, starry but distant. For the first time, he felt the sky as something cold, like a place where one could not return on impulse. Susanoo stood there, still, looking up, thinking, would he one day have to go up again? Or could he finally just stay? The wind blew hard, and for a second he felt that the answer would come with the silence, but it didn't. Only the sound of the leaves, and the cold in his hands. The night passed slowly, like all the others. But inside him, something was beginning to move, still small, still contained, but inevitable. The days went on. The wind changed direction. The leaves fell. The earth opened up for new seeds. Everything seemed peaceful. And yet, something bothered Susanoo, a restlessness that did not come from outside. It was not a threat, nor fear. It was as if, inside him, there was a poorly placed stone, small, but uncomfortable, and that, from time to time, moved. He didn't talk about it to anyone, not out of pride, but because he couldn't explain it. It was just an emptiness that appeared at the end of the day when everything was done. The house was tidy, the fire was lit, the food was served, and yet something was missing, or something was left over. Maybe both. Kushinada noticed. She had that calm look of someone who understands the silence of others. She didn't demand anything, but she was attentive. She took care of him with gestures. She brought him tea at the right time. She leaned on his shoulder when he took too long to speak, and that helped. But it didn't solve anything, because what hurt Susanoo wasn't his life with her. It was the rest, the before. What had been in suspense since he was thrown to earth like a celestial problem. He had defeated the serpent, saved a village, built a home, created a routine. It was more than most gods had ever done, but there was still something that didn't fit. The sword he had taken from Yamata. No Orochi's tail was kept, well cared for, wrapped in cloth. He cleaned it every now and then, with respect. He knew it was no ordinary weapon. It had meaning, and perhaps that was what disturbed him the most, because even there, living as a man, he still carried the trail of God, and that cannot be erased. It cannot be hidden. It only disguises itself for a time. On a colder night than usual, he walked alone along the trail that led to the old battlefield. The tall grass now hid most of it. The platforms had rotted away, but he knew where to step. He knew where every piece of his past was buried. He stood there, staring into space. The sky, clear and cloudless, seemed to tease him. It showed him the vastness of where he had come from, and where he did not want to return. He thought of Amaterasu. It had been a long time since he had dreamed of her, but he felt her presence sometimes, as if the sun took longer to set on certain days, as if the light came more direct, warmer, just to remind him that she still existed, and that he, somehow, still belonged to something greater. He sighed, one of those sighs that has no sound, only weight. He knew that the sword, kept so carefully, was not just a symbol. It was a bridge, an obligation, something he would have to give up one day, not out of duty, but out of cycle, out of meaning, and that hurt because it meant leaving there, leaving behind what he had built, breaking a piece that had taken him so long to accept. He walked home slowly, each step heavier than the last. He went inside. The wood creaked, as always. The smell of freshly brewed tea still hung in the air. Kushinada was awake, sitting by the fire. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, with that same look she always had. Direct, simple, without pressure. He came closer. He sat down next to her. They stayed like that for a few minutes, until he said, almost in a whisper, "Maybe I need to go." She didn't react right away. She picked up a piece of wood and put it on the fire. The crackling sound of the wood filled the space. Then, looking into the flames, she said, "When?" He didn't answer. because he didn't know, and maybe it wasn't even now, but he had to say it. He had to admit that this home, however real it might be temporary, not by choice, but by nature. Kushinada didn't try to hold him back. She didn't encourage him either. She just stayed present, as she always had been. She knew that the world of the gods was made of movement, and that even a tired god, sooner or later, is pulled back to what he left open. That night, they slept together, but apart, not because of a fight, but out of respect for each other's silence. And even with his body there, Susanoo's mind was already starting to move, slowly, like a tide returning. Susanoo woke up before the light touched the ceiling of the house. There was no sound, no birds, no wind, only the internal noise of someone who has already decided, but does not yet know how to say it. He sat up slowly, ran his hands over his face, and took a deep breath. The world seemed suspended, as if everything was waiting for him to move first. On the opposite side of the room, Kushinada was already awake. She didn't make any noise. She didn't even look directly at him. She just ran her fingers over a cloth that she was folding calmly, as if she knew and she accepted. Susanoo said nothing. He got up, left the house, and went to the back, where the sword was still kept. He carefully picked up the package. He held it for a few seconds before opening it. The shine of the blade appeared like a memory. It didn't look old, nor new, just eternal, like anything that carries more than one destiny. There, between his hands, he felt again the moment when he had removed it from the serpent's body, the weight of victory, the silence of the last severed head. And now, what remained was not glory. It was responsibility. He rewrapped the sword. He set it aside. Then he grabbed a few simple things: some dried rice, a clay water bottle, a small blanket, just the essentials. And yet, each item felt like a piece of the home he was trying not to tear away. Inside, Kushinada was preparing tea. She made 2 cups. She placed them next to each other, as she did every day. When he came back, she didn't speak. She just gently pushed the cup away. He sat down. He took it. He drank. The taste was the same as always, but that day, it seemed slower, as if the tea tasted better too. After a while, he said, "I don't know how long I'll be gone." She nodded. She didn't ask where. She didn't ask why. She just said, "I'll take care of the house." There was a long silence, and within it, everything was said. They ate together, in silence. He watched her every now and then, the way she held her utensils, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she stared into the fire, not sadly, but steadily. Kushinada was not a weak woman. She never had been. And here she was, ready to let go of what she might want to keep. That, more than any words, was love. After the meal, Susanoo stood up. He picked up the bundle with the sword and strapped it tightly to his back. He didn't look back immediately. He took a deep breath, as if he knew that once he took a step, everything would change. At the door, he stopped. He turned. He looked at her, still sitting, still calm, still present. He didn't say goodbye, just a look that contained everything: gratitude, regret, promise. She responded with a small gesture, a barely visible wave, as if to say, "Go, but come back if you can." He left. The path down the hill seemed longer than ever. Every stone, every root, every curve, everything held a piece of the story he was leaving behind. And yet, his feet moved forward, slowly but surely. The village was still asleep. The windows were closed. The steam from the kitchens was beginning to rise in thin streams. No one knew. No one saw him pass. Maybe it was better that way. When he reached the edge of the trees, he stopped once more. He looked back. Shuga's palace was just a speck among the foliage, but he knew it. Every corner, every smell, every night. moved on. The forest closed in as I walked. The sounds changed. The birds woke up. The wind rustled through the leaves with more noise. The world outside was louder than I remembered. And yet, Susanoo walked, the sword tapped lightly on his back, with each step. A reminder, a call, and perhaps a bridge back to heaven, to his sister, to the part of himself he had yet to face. But for now, there was no destination, only a path, and as the branches closed behind him, the palace grew quiet, still, but not empty, because Kushinada was still there, waiting, maybe, but not promising, not holding back. The path Susanoo followed was not made for divine feet. It was narrow, full of loose rocks, low branches, and annoying insects. But he didn't complain. Not now. With each step, I left a piece of the routine behind, a piece of the calm life, of the solid ground, of Kushinada's presence, which continued to burn in the back of my mind like the last fire of a long night. His body ached slightly, but it wasn't the physical effort that weighed him down. It was the uncertainty. What awaited him out there? Was he still remembered as a god? Was he still feared or forgotten? Time among men has a different rhythm, slower, more subtle. But in the world of the gods, things are raw, direct. Either you serve a purpose or you become noise. The forest began to open up, revealing the foot of a mountain. In the past, he would have flown, avoided the effort, but now he preferred to climb, step by step, as if each meter was necessary to empty his mind, to put his ideas in place, and to remember why. Even without wanting to, he needed to come back. Amaterasu had sent no message, no clear sign, no call, but he knew. He felt. The sword could not remain with him forever. It was a symbol, a link between earth and heaven, and he, no matter how much he tried to run from it, was still part of that link. The path became steeper, less vegetation, more stone. The air was colder. The altitude made his thoughts slow. His body, already accustomed to the simple life, found this kind of demand strange. But Susanoo continued, not as a warrior, nor as a penitent, as someone who knows that there are things you cannot avoid forever. On his first night out, he found shelter between two large moss-covered rocks. He lit a small fire. He roasted a handful of roots he had gathered along the way. He ate slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames. The silence of the night was different, not the calm silence of the hill, but a harsh silence of real solitude, of things that lurk and do not show themselves. There, alone, he thought of Kushinada again, not in images, but in sensations. The smell of the tea, the warmth of her body beside him, the way she touched the leaves before planting them. That was what held him. Not the memory, but the absence that is felt in the body more than in the mind. He lay down on his thin cloak, covering himself as best he could, and before he fell asleep, he touched the sword once more, just to feel that it was still there, that the edge remained, that the duty was still real. The dream came quickly, as if it had been expected. In the dream, he did not walk. He floated through a corridor of light and wind. At the end, Amaterasu's voice called to him, but not with anger, with doubt, as if asking, why did it take so long? He tried to answer, but his mouth would not open, and then he saw himself before her, not as a brother, but as someone lesser, someone who had failed. The goddess said nothing. She just pointed to the sword, and then the dream shattered, like thin glass hit by a breath. He woke up to the sun rising behind the mountains. The sky was orange and lilac. A biting cold bit his feet. He got up slowly. His joints protested, but his body responded. He walked a little further in silence. A group of crows flew overhead in a crooked line, letting out hoarse cries. They seemed to be heading in the same direction. At noon he reached a plateau. From there he could see the entire valley, Small villages, winding rivers, clouds casting shadows across the hills. It was beautiful, but it was not his destination. It was just a break. He sat down, drank water, ate a little. He thought little. He just existed. That was all he could do. At the edge of the cliff, he noticed a solitary flower growing among the rocks. Fragile, out of place, but insistent. He touched it carefully, and for the first time in days, he smiled. Small, but real. He stood up, adjusted the sword on his back, and continued. The climb began again. The sky still seemed far away, but now it was a little closer. The air changed. With each step, the higher the sound, the less. The vegetation thinned. The earth became gray and hard. The path no longer seemed part of the human world. It was another place, a suspended space, where time seemed to wait for the next decision. Susanoo recognized this feeling. He was approaching the entrance to Takamagahara, the heavenly plain, the place where everything began and from where he had been banished. There, between the end of the earth and the beginning of the sky, was a threshold that no one crossed by accident. One had to want to, and carry the weight of it on one's shoulders. He stopped in front of an ancient bridge, made of pale stone. It was not wide, nor imposing, but there was a silent vibration about it, as if to say, only those who still belong can pass here. He stood still. The wind blew through the rocks, cold and steady. Behind him, the vastness of the mountain. Ahead, the kingdom of the gods. He touched the sword with his right hand. Still there, firm, shining discreetly, as if he too felt the return. He took a deep breath. He remembered what he had done, and what he could no longer avoid. He crossed the bridge slowly. Each step echoed, like the beating of a distant drum. When he reached the other side, the sky grew brighter, not because of the sun, but because of a light that seemed to come from within everything. The trees had tall, smooth trunks. The leaves were dense, but almost translucent. The ground was firm, without dust, as if no time had passed there, as if everything occupied exactly the place it was supposed to be. He walked slowly, as if he didn't want to wake up old mistakes. There was no one in sight, but he could feel it. The other gods knew. They were watching, not with anger, but with attention, as if they were waiting to see what he would do this time. He passed a field of white stones. He remembered when he had played there, when he was still young, trying to impress Amaterasu with improvised thunderclaps. She found him noisy, but funny. For a while, they had been close, until pride began to push them in opposite directions. Now, everything was quiet. The rocks, the winds, the invisible eyes all around. He arrived at a gate, tall, but simple. There were no guards. Only a bell hung at the top, turning gently in the wind. That was it. The Hall of Light, where Amaterasu lived, where the light was densest, cleanest, where the past was concentrated like golden dust. Susanoo did not touch the gate. He knelt first. He took the sword from his back. He placed it in front of him. The gesture was simple, but heavy. He did not know if it would be accepted or if he wanted forgiveness, but he knew he had to give it up because the sword did not belong to him. It never had. It belonged to the world, and the world still needed it. He closed his eyes for a moment. He felt his body vibrate, a warmth coming from within. Then he stood up. He pushed the gate with both hands. It gave way, effortlessly, without a sound. Inside, the light blinded him for a moment. It was not violent, but absolute. White, golden, calm. When his eyes adjusted, he saw Amaterasu sitting upright, her long hair tied back with threads of pale silk. Her eyes found his immediately. There was no anger, but there was distance, a long gap between siblings who had lost themselves in the midst of their own story. He walked to the center of the room. He knelt down again. He held out the sword with both hands. The goddess looked. She stood up. She walked towards him. She picked up the blade. She held it as if she had recognized something lost. And then she said, "This sword speaks of your pain." He didn't answer. "But it also talks about your choice," she added. Silence. Just the light vibrating in the back of the room. Amaterasu turned around. She placed her sword on a white marble stone. She turned to him. For a second, her face softened. "You don't need to apologize. You didn't come for me." Susanoo looked up. There was no pride there anymore. No defiance, just weariness and acceptance. She stepped a little closer. She placed her hand on his shoulder. "Now go. You found your place. And it's not here." He nodded. He stood up. He left in silence. The light still followed him, but it was different. Lighter, more human, more his. As he crossed the gate, he felt the weight of the sword dissolve from his back, and for the first time, he was truly free. The journey back was silent. Susanoo descended the mountain as if floating. His body was still tired, but his mind, light. Something had been resolved up there. Not with words, not with requests, but with presence. And that was more than enough. He didn't look back. There was no need to. The sky was where it belonged, and so was he. Now, for the first time, he knew that he no longer belonged there. That power didn't define him, that Amaterasu's light was beautiful, but it wasn't his, it was hers. And he was made of something else. Of wind, perhaps. Of doubt. Of strength that didn't need to prove anything. His steps became firmer as he descended. The air once again began to smell of earth, moss, and humidity. The sound of leaves filled his ears. The trail that had seemed long before now became shorter, as if the world were saying, "You already know the way." At some point, he stopped in front of a stream. The water ran quickly, but without any aggressive noise. He squatted down, washed his face, his arms, his hands, as if he were removing old skin. The reflection in the water revealed a calmer face, simpler, still with divine features, but with a serene weariness that made him seem almost human. He continued down. The daylight was already fading. The afternoon was announced with that lazy gold that covers the mountains, and with it came the memory of home, of Shuga's palace, of the crooked roof, of the smell of tea, of the sound of Kushinada's low voice. He thought of her as someone who misses someone, but not fears them. He wasn't afraid of meeting her again, nor of her absence. He knew that if she were still there, the fire would be burning, and if she wasn't, he would understand, because no one waits forever, not even those who love. He passed the tall trees, the familiar stones, the path where he had once carried wood, gathered roots, built a home with his hands, and then, as he rounded the last bend, he saw it. The palace was still there. The same wood, the same straw ropes, the same thin smoke coming out of the side. He stopped just to observe, just to let that moment enter slowly, without invading, like someone who respects a temple he helped to build. He approached with slow steps. The floor creaked beneath his feet, but not in protest. It was like a greeting, an ancient greeting. When he reached the door, he didn't knock, he just waited. She appeared shortly after, Kushinada. No rush, no fear, as if he knew exactly the minute he would arrive. Her look was not one of surprise, nor of demand. It was a complete look, present and calm. He smiled, for the first time, a full smile. No mask, no tension. She didn't smile back, but she didn't look away either. She just watched him, as if she was looking for signs of what had changed. And maybe there, she had found them. Susanoo said nothing. He simply took off his cloak. He landed beside the entrance. He slowly sat down on the wooden step and looked up at the sky, which was already tinged with orange. Kushinada sat down next to him with the same lightness, and for a few minutes, they stayed there, without speaking, without touching, just existing in the same space, in the same time. After a while, she got up. She went into the house. She came back with 2 cups of tea. He handed one to him. He sat down again. He drank. The taste was the same. Silence, too. But there was something new between them. Not exactly happiness, not exactly peace. It was a kind of comfort without promises, like knowing that love is there, but it doesn't need to be named every day. Night fell slowly. The stars began to appear, one by one, like old friends returning without warning. Susanoo leaned his back against the wall of the house. He smelled the wood, the warmth of the tea between his hands, and he thought maybe this was all. Not the end of the story, but the point where it began to make sense. And for the first time, he didn't have to leave. The routine returned without fanfare, as if it had never left, as if the time between Susanoo's departure and his return had been just a parenthesis, not a break. The house was the same. The path to the vegetable garden was still well trodden. The pots held the dried rice from last summer. The kettle still hissed in the same corner of the porch, announcing the end of the afternoon with that usual light sound. Susanoo resumed his old gestures as if they were extensions of his body, arranging the firewood, sweeping the leaves from the entrance, sharpening tools, adjusting the bamboo windows so the wind wouldn't blow in. But everything now had a different weight, a different silence, more solid. It was no longer the life of someone who was running away. It was the life of someone who had arrived. Kushinada continued his routine with the same firm calm. He took care of the plants, the seeds, the food. He didn't ask questions, nor did he offer any explanation. It was as if a simple agreement had been signed between the two of them, without words. You're back. Everything is fine. We don't need to dissect what has already happened, and maybe that was the secret. Not trying to understand everything, just live what comes. With care, with presence, with space. Some nights, Susanoo would wake before dawn. He would go outside and sit on the smooth stone beside the well. He would look up at the sky, which was still dark, but promised light. He would think little, or at least, he would think slowly, about the sword he had left with Amaterasu, about what it meant, about the fact that, for the first time, he did not miss the sky. He was no longer a god of thunder, or of pride. He was just someone who chose to stay, who now knew the value of a home, of a hot tea, of a silent conversation on the porch, of a presence that demands nothing more than being there. During the day, the sun still beat down on his back as he carried buckets, fixed the roof, planted new seedlings. But Susanoo didn't mind. The pain in his shoulders, the sweat on his forehead, it all made sense. It was meaningful effort, and that was rare. Kushinada watched him sometimes. From afar, with eyes that knew a lot, she understood the instability of the gods. She knew that Susanoo was made of layers, of intensities that sometimes recede, other times explode. But she also knew how to wait and accept, and that was her strength. Not delicacy, but constancy. One afternoon, when the wind was blowing colder, Susanoo found a large, smooth stone near the hillside. He decided to drag it to the front of the house. It took a while. His body protested, but he liked it, the tiredness that comes from doing something with your hands. When he was done, he cleaned the surface of the stone with a straw brush. Then he sat down on it, and he stayed there, looking at the horizon. Kushinada came soon after. He brought a folded cloth and placed it on the stone. He sat down beside him. Neither of them said anything, but the gesture was clear. This was now a bench, a pause, a place to watch the world go by without having to run after it. Over the next few days, that corner became a habit, After work, before dusk, the two of them would sit there. Sometimes they would drink tea. Sometimes they would just watch the sky change colors. And in that small space, on that makeshift rock, they built something that many would call home, but that, for them, was even simpler. It was just here. They didn't need to dream of more or less. They just kept going, one day at a time, with the seasons setting the pace, with the sound of the wind telling them when it was time to close the windows, and the sound of the cricket telling them when it was time to sleep. And so, without promises, without drama, without definitive endings, the god of storms found, for the first time, the center of a place that no longer rotated, a place that just stayed. Time settled over Shuga's palace like a thin mist. It wasn't the kind of weather you counted in days or weeks. It was a more ancient time, one that was measured in seeds that sprouted, in leaves that fell, in clothes that faded in the sun. This was the time that now defined Susanoo and Kushinada. The mornings began the same way, the sound of the fire lighting, the steam from the tea spiraling upward, the sound of the wood adjusting underfoot. Susanoo would go out to check the land, the fences, the stream. Kushinada would hang out the washed fabrics, feed the chickens, and stir the herbs, hanging to dry. Each person had their job. Each gesture had its story, but everything was done with that calm slowness of someone who knows the world will not run away. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to either. Communication was different. When one came back with mud on his feet, the other would leave a basin of water. When the wind changed, someone would collect the cloths before the rain fell. When the silence stretched out too long, a sigh or a hot cup of tea would suffice. It was a kind of ancient language, made of coexistence and observation. One late afternoon, Susanoo returned from the forest with a small injured bird in his hands. He had found it lying among the rocks, trying to take flight with a crooked wing. He entered the house without saying anything. He simply showed the animal. Kushinada prepared a cloth and a quiet corner. Simple, direct care. Nothing grand. And together, without planning, they spent days feeding the bird, cleaning its wounds, protecting it from the cold. Little by little, she got better. She started to jump, then to walk, and then, one of those warm days, she took flight. She went out through the open window. She disappeared among the trees. Susanoo stared at the sky for a while. Then he went back inside, in silence, but something in his face said that it had been important, not because of the bird, but because of the gesture Kushinada noticed. As always, at night, they made rice with ginger and smoked fish. They sat on the large stone, now polished with use. They ate slowly, in silence, and when they finished, they just looked at the sky. The stars appeared calmly. The breeze carried the smell of damp grass. Susanoo turned to her. He stared at her for a moment. Then he said, "You know, when I was in heaven, everything was too big. The words, the gestures, the mistakes. Here, everything is small, but that's why it lasts." Kushinada did not answer immediately. Then he said simply, "Because small things can wait." Silence returned, but it was a complete silence, as if an agreement had been renewed there, without the need for a signature. The following days followed the same rhythm. There was always something to do. A hole in the fence, a leak in the roof, a rice plant that grew crookedly. Nothing urgent, but everything was important, because these tasks were what kept their world going, and they both knew this. That's why they did them with attention. Not out of obligation, that was how they lived. Taking care of each other. No effort, no promises, just caring. As if each day were the only one. As if each small gesture carried the whole world. And maybe it did. Because in the end, maybe that's what sustains the gods. Not the temples, Not the offerings, but the little things. A folded cloth, a bowl of rice, a silence that doesn't hurt, and Susanoo now was a god of that which does not need to be said to be understood. The night had been cold, the wood creaked softly beneath the blankets, the wind passed through the cracks in the house, as if asking permission to enter. Susanoo woke up slowly, hearing the usual sounds. The soft clink of utensils, the roar of the fire, Kushinada's firm footsteps walking through the house. Nothing was out of place, and yet something inside him moved. He got up, dressed slowly, and splashed water on his face. When he went outside, he found the morning covered in a light mist, as if the world had been wrapped in a damp cloth. He walked to the edge of the hill. He stood there, looking, thinking about nothing in particular, or maybe about everything at the same time. The garden was already beginning to show signs of the next harvest. The leaves were wide, the soil dark, moist, and fragrant. Kushinada had left a basket of roots by the door. He knew what that meant. He had to trade them with one of the neighboring villages, something they did from time to time. A simple, unhurried journey, just another repetition among many, but this time he wanted to go alone. She picked up the basket, adjusted it on her back, and left a short note on the table. "I'll be back in the afternoon. If it rains, I'll wait under the big tree." Kushinada didn't need more than that. She trusted. The road leading to the village was a dirt road, lined with lichen-covered rocks. The smell of wet earth accompanied him the entire way. He passed two children, picking berries. They greeted him with a shy gesture. He waved back without words. The name Susanoo no longer raised eyebrows. Now he was just the man on the hill, a familiar face, almost part of the landscape. In the village, he left the roots, picked up some strips of cloth and some salt. He exchanged a few words. He heard silent thanks. It didn't take long. He preferred to return before the rain. On the way back, he stopped at the big tree. It was a gnarled, ancient oak. Its roots emerged from the ground like huge hands. He sat down. He took off his sandal. He felt the cool earth. He took a deep breath, and there, beneath that trunk, something touched him. Not a thought, but an ancient feeling. He realized that in all this time, he had never asked himself if he was mortal, perhaps because gods do not die in the ordinary sense. But they weaken, they disappear, they are forgotten, and sometimes they choose to stop. Susanoo looked at his hands. They were no longer the same as when he had descended from heaven. There were more marks, more silence between the fingers, more human life, perhaps. But he did not regret it. The idea of the end no longer scared him. What mattered was this, being here, now, being part of something that grows slowly, that doesn't need thunder, or a sword, or eternity. He got up slowly. He shook the dust off his legs. He walked back with slow steps, not out of tiredness, but by choice. Every stone, every curve, every fallen leaf seemed to be part of the same poem. When she arrived at the palace, she saw Kushinada hanging up washed fabrics. The sun had broken through the mist. The light fell directly on the cotton threads. Slowly drying, she looked at him without surprise. As if she had been expecting him, he handed her the salt. He touched her arm lightly. That was all. Later, they sat on the rock that now had the shape of the two of them. He told her about the tree, about the rain that never came, about the children on the road. Nothing grand, but she listened as if it were, because that was how they listened to each other. As if everything was important, even the most banal. That night, they slept early. The fire was low. The wind was calm, and inside the house, there was no sound that needed to be said, only breathing, only presence. And there, between rest and silence, Susanoo understood. He didn't have to last forever. He just had to stay long enough to care, to be, to feel, and that he knew how to do. The morning went on like so many others. The smell of boiling rice, the crackling of bamboo in the wind, the shadows of the branches dancing on the palace walls. Kushinada tended to the hanging herbs, replacing the dry branches with new ones. Susanoo, in the backyard, reinforced the ropes of the wooden structure where the baskets were hung to dry. Neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said. Until the sound came, weak but different. A light, hesitant step crossing the stones of the path that led to the entrance of the house. Susanoo stopped. It was unusual for someone to climb up there. Not without reason. He stood up. He set the tool aside. He looked down the path and saw it, a small, hooded figure standing before the wooden gate. It didn't feel threatening or urgent, just out of place, like someone who's lost their way, but isn't sure if they want to be found. Susanoo approached with firm steps. Kushinada, from inside, watched through the crack in the window. The presence was unexpected, but not hostile, and that was enough to keep him calm. "Are you lost?" Susanoo asked, without raising his voice. The figure lifted his hood. He was a young man, no more than 20-something. His face was clean, his eyes alert, his clothes simple, but worn. He hesitated before speaking, as if he didn't know where to begin. They said that a god lived here, one who doesn't act like a god, one who builds with his hands. Susanoo did not answer immediately. He just looked, not with superiority, but with caution. Then he opened the gate slowly, as if inviting without promising. "And what are you looking for?" he asked, with the tone of someone who is not surprised by other people's searches. The young man took a deep breath. "Answers, or at least a little silence that makes sense." Kushinada appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a cloth. She said nothing. She just watched. As always, her presence was more steadfast than any greeting. Susanoo nodded, a simple invitation. The young man entered. He left his shoes before the porch. He sat where he was told. They drank tea. They ate rice cakes. They talked little. The young man said that he had left a distant village, that the world outside was restless, that the gods were disappearing or shouting too much, that no one heard what needed to be heard anymore, only what was shouted. And that, one of those days, an old woman had told him, "If you are looking for peace, go to where the thunder has fallen silent." And there he was. Susanoo listened to everything, without reacting. He listened well. It was one of the few things he had learned from the earth, to listen until the end, without rushing to understand. When the young man finished, there was a long silence. Then he said, "Peace doesn't live here. It only passes by from time to time. And even then, always with your eyes open." The young man nodded. He seemed to understand. He stayed there the rest of the day. He helped collect firewood, washed the dishes, mopped the floor. Nothing was asked of him, but he did it, as if that was part of the answer you were looking for. At dusk, Susanoo pointed out a corner of the house where he could sleep, a simple space with a folded blanket and a window that looked out onto the woods. The young man thanked him, not with words, but with a calm look. Kushinada served the evening meal. The fire crackled softly. The three of them sat on the usual stone. The new presence did not break the rhythm. It only added a new tone to the silence. Later, Susanoo and Kushinada lay down in their corner. She asked in a whisper, "Will he stay?" Susanoo took a moment to answer. Then he said, almost without a voice, "Maybe, for a while, or until the silence answers what he wants to know." And that was enough. The presence of someone new was not a threat, but it was change. And every change, no matter how small, shakes the edges of what seemed stable. But the palace remained standing. The breeze blew just the same. The sky darkened slowly, and night, as always, came to cover the world with a gentle promise of respite. The young man remained, not by imposition, nor by explicit invitation. He simply stayed, like someone who has found a truce and still doesn't know if he deserves it. Susanoo didn't send him away. Kushinada didn't either. The house always had room for more silence. In the early days, he kept a low profile. He helped with the chores without making a fuss. He collected leaves, washed utensils, carried water. His eyes were alert, always measuring the time of others before acting. He was a new body in the space, but he didn't get in the way. He just moved the air, subtly. Susanoo watched him, not with suspicion, but with attention. He had seen many faces that carried too many questions. Some sought redemption, others, miracles. Some simply ran away, and there were also those who came with a thirst to understand what they could not even name. That seemed to be the case. One morning, while they were sweeping the entrance to the house, the young man asked, "Is it true that you were expelled from heaven?" The question came out cautiously, almost like a stumble. Susanoo paused for a second, then he continued sweeping. "I wasn't thrown out," he replied without looking. "I went down, on my own, but maybe because I didn't know how to go up anymore." The young man was silent for a while, then he nodded, as if that answer, vague as it was enough for him for now. Kushinada listened from afar, while hanging roots to dry. Her face remained impassive, but inside her, a small alert was going off. Nothing alarming, just that ancient instinct of someone who lives with gods and knows that peace is a delicate thing that can easily be destroyed if someone blows too much. That night, during the meal, the young man spoke of his village, of the noises, of the anguish of the days that always seem to repeat themselves without being resolved, of the promises of the gods that never come down again, of the people who talk a lot and listen little. Susanoo listened, patiently, but with a certain distance in his eyes, as if he had already gone through that kind of uneasiness and was in no hurry to respond. "And you?" he asked calmly. "Are you still running away? Or do you already know what you want to find?" The young man hesitated. Then he said, in a lower tone, "I don't know, but when I heard about a god who fell silent, I thought maybe he had learned something we've all forgotten." There was a long pause after that, just the sound of the wind pushing the leaves in the courtyard. Susanoo didn't answer. He just looked at the bowl in front of him. The steam was slowly rising. Everything he had learned could not be put into words, and perhaps it would be of no use to anyone but him. Later, while the visitor slept in the corner of the house, Susanoo and Kushinada sat on the rock, as they always did. She broke the silence. "He will ask questions we no longer feel like answering." Susanoo nodded slowly. "He's still full of the world, full of hurry. And us? We have plenty of time," he said, with a brief smile. "And plenty of tiredness, too." They stayed there for a while longer. The sky was clear, the stars scattered like seeds. The wind was cold, but not cruel, and in that space, between the doubt of one and the silence of the others, the balance remained, albeit by thin threads. In the following days, the young man tried to contain his anxiety, but his restlessness was visible. He asked about gods, about thunder, about ancient wars. I wanted to understand why he was so silent, why Susanoo, with so much power, had chosen a life of earth, cloth, and tea. And with each new question, Susanoo answered less, not out of contempt, but because he knew certain answers are of no use before the right time. Sometimes what someone needs isn't an explanation, it's a break. And Suga's palace was just that, a gap between one life and another. The young man didn't understand yet, but he was within the answer I was looking for. I just didn't know how to listen. Yet the young man remained, day after day, like a leaf that doesn't fall, even with the wind. And although he didn't ask for anything, his presence was constant, a thread pulling the silence out of the house. Kushinada continued to watch, not with fear, but with the caution one has with too much water near the fire. He knew that the balance between two worlds can collapse over something as small as an impatient phrase. Susanoo, on the outside, remained the same rhythm, the same gestures, sweeping in the morning, preparing the wood in the afternoon, warm tea at the end of the day, but inside, something was moving. It wasn't discomfort, it was memory, that vague memory of when he himself was just a scream, a desire to make noise in the world. And now, faced with someone so young and restless, he saw the contours of his own downfall. On the fourth morning, the young man woke up early, earlier than everyone else. He was in the courtyard, sitting on the stone where Susanoo and Kushinada usually ended their day. When Susanoo came out of the house, he was already waiting for him with a question ready in his mouth. Why don't you do anything else? Why did you choose to stay still? Susanoo stopped a few steps away. He did not answer immediately. He sat down next to the boy. He picked up a small stone from the ground. He rolled it between his fingers. Because I spent too long trying to be someone who had to act all the time. The young man waited longer, but no other words came. Only the sound of the wind rustling the low bushes. But the world still needs people to act. There is still injustice, noise, hunger. Could you? I could, Susanoo said calmly but firmly. But I don't want to. And that's not selfishness. It's survival. The young man lowered his eyes. He remained silent. Perhaps it was the first time someone had said this so clearly. Not wanting to save the world, just taking care of one's own space, of what is within reach, and nothing more. Susanoo stood up. He went back inside. He left the boy to his thoughts. Kushinada was wiping the windows. They exchanged glances. She knew it. So did he. That visitor's time was running out. During lunch, the young man ate little. His hands were restless. His gaze was distant. Susanoo and Kushinada kept up their pace, as if they didn't want to push anything. The silence between the three of them was now thicker, like a curtain of still rain. Eventually, the man tidied up his blanket. He folded it neatly. He washed his utensils. He put everything back in its place. Then he sat down on the rock once more, and he waited. Susanoo appeared shortly after. He sat down next to him. The sky was already beginning to darken. I wanted to understand, said the young man, but I think what I found here was something else. You have found the time, Susanoo replied, and it does not answer with words. The boy nodded. A small gesture, but a loaded one, like someone who accepts that it is not yet time, but one day it will be. When night fell, he said goodbye, with a look, no promises, just a thank you that didn't need to be said. He walked along the trail, slowly, like someone leaving a dream and returning to the world. Kushinada was serving tea when Susanoo came back inside. He sat down. He picked up the cup. He drank slowly. Are you coming back? She asked. Maybe, if you need to, but maybe you don't. They stayed like that, in silence. Once again, but now, without the weight of each other's presence, just the two of them, again, like in the beginning. And then, for the first time since the young man had arrived, Susanoo said something without looking at anyone. It's strange to see someone so restless, trying to understand the value of staying. He didn't understand, Kushinada replied, but he began to listen, and that, for them, was enough. The night progressed. The house fell silent. The wind began to blow lightly again. Life went on. Still the same, but with a new twist. Silence once again filled every corner of the house. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It had taken on new contours, as if it had been polished by the visitors passing. Now, each daily gesture seemed more solid, more conscious, as if someone who, after almost losing something, better understands what was left. Susanoo woke up to the sound of the kettle. The steam rose like a thin thread to the wooden ceiling. Kushinada put the cups back in their usual place, but there was something different between the two of them. Nothing said, nothing direct, just a shared rhythm, that was once again theirs alone. In the yard, the dry leaves were piling up more intensely. Autumn had arrived with wind and fog. The nights were longer. The days were shorter. It was the time when the earth retreats. And perhaps, for that very reason, Susanoo also retreated more. He sat for longer periods in front of the stove. He watched the flames with long eyes, not out of sadness, but out of presence. Kushinada noticed. He always noticed. He knew that for him, each season had an echo, and autumn brought back deeper memories of when he had descended, of when everything had been confused, of when the sky had seemed unreachable and the earth still a stranger. Now, the sky was just a distant name, and the earth was home. One morning she handed him a small box. Dark wood. No ornament, just a clasp of woven straw. He looked at it lightly. He opened it slowly. Inside was a small sculpture, made by her, in stone. It was the figure of a man sitting, head bowed, hands on his knees. His features were simple, but undeniably, it was him. Why? He asked in a low voice. Because you need to see yourself every now and then, she replied. He said nothing more. He touched the sculpture with his fingers. He closed the box carefully and placed it on the shelf. Just one gesture, but full of understanding. She knew he would never ask for something like that. And that's why she offered. That day, they didn't speak again, but they were together all the time. They planted potatoes. They repaired the corner of the wall that had been blown off by the wind. They cleaned up the puddle behind the house. In the evening, they ate hot rice with bitter sprouts. It tasted dry, but comforting. When they sat on the rock, the sky was clear. The stars were visible as never before. Kushinada pointed to a constellation. She said the name, then another. Then she was silent. Susanoo looked up. He recognized some. Others, he had forgotten. The sky was no longer where he belonged, but it was still familiar, like a childhood town where you don't return, but remember. Do you miss it? She asked without turning her face. He thought for a few seconds. Then he answered, No, I miss it, but I don't miss it. They are different things. She understood. The next morning, they began sewing new winter cloth. They cut fabric, reinforced seams. As they did so, Susanoo stopped for a moment. He looked at her. He saw her nimble fingers, her focused eyes, the slight curve of her neck as she held the needle. I never knew how to stay anywhere, he said, without warning. And now? She asked, without raising her head. Now I don't want to leave. She just nodded. She sewed another line. Then she looked up and smiled. Small, but whole. Time passed. The leaves dried. The birds migrated. The cold began to seep through the cracks. And the palace continued, standing, calm, attached to the ground with invisible roots. There were no certainties there, only permanence. And permanence, for someone who had been a wandering god, was already miracle enough. The days went by without any news. What, for most, could be boredom, for Susanoo and Kushinada, was relief. The repetition of gestures, the predictable sound of the wind between the windows, the familiar taste of tea before dusk. Everything there had a purpose. Nothing was by chance, but even silence, when it lasts too long, begins to show cracks. And one morning, Susanoo noticed, his body was the same, his tasks the same, but inside him, something was beginning to weigh, not as sadness, nor as doubt. It was something else, a tiredness without origin, a feeling that, even in the right place, time still passes. Sitting on the edge of the hillside, he watched the valley covered in mist. The autumn leaves danced in a slow, spiraling rhythm. The sky was white, like an endless wall. And there, in that white, he felt the weight of everything he had lived, not in the form of memories, but as a sum. Every choice, every fall, every silence maintained. They were all there, piled up inside his chest. Kushinada appeared minutes later. He sat down next to her. He didn't ask anything. He didn't explain either. They stayed together, and in that silent gesture, she knew the weight had returned, and maybe it was time to just watch. During the day, Susanoo worked the land. He reinforced the fence. He sharpened tools. Everything was as usual, but his movements were a little slower. His gaze was more distant, as if he were doing what he needed to do, but was no longer so busy with the tasks. At night, they ate in silence. The fire crackled low. Kushinada washed the utensils more calmly than necessary. Susanoo folded a cloth repeatedly, as if he expected that, at the end of the fold, something would reveal itself, but it didn't. It was just a cloth. Before going to sleep, he got up. He went outside. The air was cold. The sky was clear. The moon was high. He walked to the tree at the edge of the land, the same tree that had once sheltered him in the rain, had once listened to him silently. He touched the trunk with his open palm. He stayed there. He didn't ask for anything. He just breathed, and without knowing why, he remembered his father, Izanagi, creator of the world, ancient, distant god. They had never been close. But at that moment, he felt his absence clearly, not as a lack, but as a shadow. He thought of everything that came before, in heaven, in exile, in the serpent, in Kushinada, and he realized how much time had passed, how much the body carried, how much the soul had stopped searching. The next day, she said nothing, but Kushinada noticed his slower steps, his gaze fixed too intently on the window, his forgotten cup half empty. She didn't press him, but she made ginger tea. She laid out extra blankets. She adjusted his pillow before he lay down. And that was all she could do. Take care of the margins. Because sometimes, what a god needs is not healing. It's presence. In the following days, the fog did not dissipate. The sky remained white. The earth seemed suspended, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Susanoo still did his tasks, but with less haste, with less precision, as if he were waiting for something, without knowing what. One afternoon, he stopped in front of the reflecting pool at the back of the house. The face reflected was older, still firm, but worn, not by the years, but by permanence, and by the absence of escapes. There, in that reflection, he also saw fear, not of death, but of uselessness, of oblivion, from the silence that no longer serves anyone. But then, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Kushinada, who looked at him as always. No questions, no demands, just presence. And in that light touch, something in Susanoo reorganized itself. He remembered that it wasn't for glory that he was there, nor for destiny, but by choice, because someone stayed, and because he also chose to stay. That night, the tiredness continued, but it was different. A tiredness with a name, with roots, and the simple fact of recognizing it was already rest. Susanoo woke up before dawn. The sky was still colorless. The house breathed slowly, as if it were also sleeping. He got up slowly, without making a sound. He went through the kitchen, knocked on the door, and then went outside. The air was cold, but not sharp. It only reminded his body that he was alive. He sat down on the damp stone. His clothes were still heavy from the dew of the previous night. He stayed there, without thinking about anything in particular, or maybe everything at the same time. Life had become too simple to call divine, and yet it required constant attention. There were no rituals, no offerings, but there was the stove that needed to be lit, the wall that needed to be reinforced, the field that needed to be tended. This was the faith that now sustained him, the repetition that is never the same, the small effort that no one sees, and yet keeps the world standing. Eventually, he began to hear sounds from the house, the soft clink of pots, the sound of cloth being wrung out, the hiss of the kettle. Kushinada was awake, as always, and he knew he wouldn't have to say anything. She would understand what he needed: space, tea, and time. Little by little, the sky brightened, not in a hurry. The light appeared as if groping the edges of the darkness, and in that play of light and shadow, Susanoo saw himself reflected in the wet stones of the courtyard. His face was tired, his shoulders were heavy, but his gaze, still firm, still present. Kushinada brought the tea. He sat down next to her. He didn't say good morning. He just handed her the cup, and he stayed, looking at the same view, sharing the same silence, and that was more intimate than any words. After tea, they worked together in the garden. The soil was cool but loose. Their hands sank in easily. They planted roots. They tied stems together. They exchanged tools without looking. Their bodies knew each other's movements. Their memories were physical, and even without touching, they were connected. At noon, they had lunch under the roof: plain rice, roasted vegetables, warm water. Food didn't need to be elaborate. What kept them going was habit. The habit of sharing, of chewing at the same pace, of knowing that right next to them, there was someone who had also chosen to continue. In the afternoon, Susanoo walked to the field where the snake had been. Nothing remained. Vegetation had covered everything. The soil was new, full of insects, of small life. He stayed there for a while, remembering, not with longing, nor regret, just a memory, because certain things, no matter how far away they are, continue to live in some corner of the body. He picked up a smooth stone from the ground. He put it in his pocket, a simple gesture, a reminder that the past exists, but it no longer bites. On his way home, he stopped at the stream. He washed his hands. He watched the water flow, always moving, but always the same. And he thought, maybe peace is not the absence of pain. Maybe it is this: accepting that it comes and goes, like the river, and that even when it seems to have gone away, it always returns. Arriving at the palace, he found Kushinada cleaning the utensils, her hair tied up, her sleeves rolled up, her face calm. The scene was so common that for a moment he wanted to freeze it. He wanted that moment to last forever. But he knew that was not how time worked. He went in, he helped put away the cloths. He folded them one by one, without rushing. Then he sat down on the worn cushion on the porch. Kushinada sat next to him. "You went deeper than usual today," she said. He looked at her. "I went as far as the pain could no longer reach." She nodded. She understood. "And what did you find?" "Silence, but a new one. Older. More mine." She smiled, small. Then she leaned her shoulder against his, and there they stayed. Night came slowly. The wind blew, but it didn't scare anyone. The light disappeared, line by line, until only the outlines of things remained. And even though he hadn't done anything extraordinary that day, Susanoo knew that he was closer to you than he had ever been. The sky that morning was too clear, an intense blue, without clouds, a kind of clarity that made the world seem sharper, as if everything were slightly more visible. Susanoo noticed it as soon as he woke up. The light hit the ceiling boards differently. The air had a different weight, still cold, but sharp, as if to say, "Today, something is shifting." He got up slowly. His bones complained a little. Nothing that bothered him, just the subtle reminder that his body was no longer new, and that, in some way, that was good. Kushinada was in the kitchen. The tea was ready. The light scent of ginger and herbs warmed the room. She placed the cup in front of him. He accepted it with a nod. He drank slowly, and there, between one sip and the next, he knew that the day would be more about observation than action. They went out into the yard together. The sky remained absurdly clear. The shadows were sharp, well drawn on the ground. It was as if the whole world had been freshly washed. The dry branches swayed unhurriedly. The old leaves flew in gentle directions, and for a while, the two of them just stared, without doing anything, without saying anything. Around noon, the wind picked up, strong, sudden. It knocked down one of the porch structures. Pots fell. Cloths flew. Nothing serious. But it was enough to break the immobile state of the house. Kushinada ran to hold the fabrics. Susanoo grabbed the fallen structure. They worked together. Quickly, almost without speaking, the bodies knew what to do, like an ancient training. There was no panic, only precision. After everything was arranged, they sat on the large stone, tired but calm. "The world woke us up," she said, between one breath and the next. "Every now and then, he remembers that he's still spinning," he replied. They drank water. They remained silent. The wind was still blowing, but now with less force. As if to say, it was just a scare. Susanoo looked out over the field. He saw a nest on the ground. It had probably fallen from a tree. He approached. Inside was a small, cracked egg. There was no bird. There was no visible life, only the delicate, intact structure. He picked it up carefully. He brought it to Kushinada. He showed it to her, without saying anything. She looked at it. She touched it with her fingertips. "It's just an empty egg," he said, "or a sign that everything really begins after the fall." She smiled, a small smile, like she agreed, but didn't need to say it. They kept the nest inside the house. They placed it on the shelf, next to the small sculpture she had made of it. Now there was a small altar there. No gods, only memories, only gestures, only pieces of life. That evening, they ate in silence. The wind had returned to normal. The house was warm. The floor was swept. Order was restored. But there was something different about the way they looked at things. The fallen structure, the flying cloths, the cracked egg, they all seemed part of the same reminder that at the very center of the world, there is displacement, and that their role was not to stop time, but to accompany it. Susanoo looked at Kushinada across the table. He saw the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, her firm but scarred hands, the way she folded the cloths without haste. And he thought, this is what is called permanence. Not the kind that resists, but the kind that embraces. Later, they sat on the porch. The sky was dark. The stars were coming back one by one. The cold was getting stronger. She covered them both with a thin blanket. She rested her head on his shoulder. They didn't say anything. The house seemed even more alive now. Not because of what it contained, but because of what I remembered. Every crack, every object out of place, every visible repair. Everything was proof that someone lived there. Really, without spectacle, without mythology. And Susanoo, with his eyes fixed on some point in the sky, thought, perhaps this is the miracle that men have always sought. Not to fly, not to turn water into wine, but to be here, with someone, with peace, with space for the wind. The cold was already deeper. The mornings started later, the nights came earlier. The house seemed to breathe less, as if saving energy. The wood cracked more frequently. The cloths took longer to dry. The water in the stream was colder. It hurt his fingers. Susanoo felt the weight of winter approaching. But he wasn't afraid. It was just another visitor, an old acquaintance. And like every old visitor, he knew what to prepare. More firewood, more tea, less urgency. Kushinada had already reinforced the edges of the doors. He had placed extra blankets on the bed. He was drying roots next to the stove, where the heat from the fire reached best. Everything was taken care of. Everything was anticipated. Nothing was rushed. That was how they lived now, anticipating the weather, not reacting to it. That morning, Susanoo went out to check the countryside. Dry leaves covered the ground like a layer of remembrance. The earth was firm, a little hard. The trees were bare, their branches like fingers, pointing to the sky. He looked around. He felt the landscape curved, as if the world were tilting. Not from tiredness, but from return, as if something was preparing to gather. He stopped in front of a stone he hadn't seen for a long time. It was covered in moss, but it still bore the mark he had left years ago when he had defeated the serpent, a fissure in the shape of a cross. He touched it with his fingers. The cold of the stone penetrated his skin. He stood there for a while, in silence. The memory came back clearly, but not of the blood, nor of the scream. What came was the image of Kushinada, frightened, hiding behind the straw gate. It was because of her that everything had begun to change. He walked back slowly. His body felt heavier, not from walking, but from memory. He went into the house. He washed his hands. He found Kushinada in the kitchen, stirring a pot of thick broth. The smell was strong. Garlic, ginger, something that warmed him from the inside. He sat down. He waited. She served. They ate together, in silence. After the meal, she took a wooden box that was stored high on the shelf. She placed it on the table. She opened it slowly. Inside were scraps of old paper, fragments of the past that she had saved, letters, written cloths, pieces of prayer. Susanoo looked at it curiously. She rarely opened it. She picked up one of the papers. It was a note he had left them in the first days together. Some note, "I'll be back in the evening. Prepare strong tea." She read it and smiled. It was strange to see her own handwriting so old, and to think that they were still there, together. Every evening, Kushinada took them out, one by one, showing them without explaining. Small objects, a button, a piece of pottery, a piece of netting. Everything had a story, but none of it was told. It was just the gesture of showing, sharing, and Susanoo, at that moment, felt something rare. Gratitude without guilt. Not all gods have this. Most live in debt. To the world, to their own mistakes. But there, with her, he felt something complete, as if what they had built, even if small, was already enough. That night, the sky was clear, but the cold prevented them from going out on the porch. They stayed inside the house. Near the fire, Kushinada took an old cloth. She began to sew. Susanoo sharpened a blade, each one in their own way, but time was shared. Then she said, "We are almost at the end of the cycle." He looked at her. "Which cycle?" "This one. The one of silence that cured you." He nodded, slowly. "And what comes next?" She sighed, not as if she were tired, but as if she accepted it, whatever comes, with the same care. And that was enough. The wind blew outside, the windows creaked, the fire flickered, and in that simple house, high above the valley, two beings, once called God and Offering, shared time as if it were an old blanket, patched but still warm. The morning was gray. There was no fog, but the sky seemed made of stone. A silent weight hung over the field. Kushinada noticed it first. The wind had changed direction. The smoke from the stove didn't rise as it used to. It danced in low swirls, as if hesitating. Susanoo noticed it too. He felt it in his chest, even before his body responded. A kind of internal echo, like an ancient drum that begins to vibrate, even when no one is playing. It was the world warning him. Get ready. It was no alarm, no tragedy, just movement. And every change, no matter how small, shakes the ground beneath one's feet. They continued their day as usual. Warm tea, small tasks. They washed the cloths, swept the entrance, separated roots to dry. But Susanoo's eyes were more distant, not with sadness, but with scope. He saw beyond the routine. Kushinada brought out a new blanket that she had sewn in secret. She spread it on the floor, near the fire. She gestured for him to sit down. Susanoo obeyed. She sat down too, and there they sat, facing each other. Total silence. After a while, she said, "Do you still feel like leaving?" Susanoo took a while to respond. "No, but sometimes I feel like I've had as much as I could." She nodded. No hurt, just understanding. The time spent with someone is not measured by duration, but by its entirety. He closed his eyes for a moment. It touched him deeply because it was true. He had been whole, even with flaws, even with difficult silences, even with the past still pulsing at times. He had been whole with her. Kushinada held her hand. It was cold, but firm, like the earth in winter. If it's time to end, let it be light. And if it isn't, he asked, then let it be whole a little longer. They both smiled, small, but sincere. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees swayed more violently. A few loose leaves hit the wall of the house. Nothing serious, but enough to remind you, the world doesn't wait. During the afternoon, Susanoo walked around the field. He revisited the places he had before, the rock where he had sat on the first day, the stream where he had washed his hands after the fight, the tree where he had taken shelter from the rain. Each spot bore a fragment, and he touched them calmly, as if he were saying goodbye, not because he was leaving, but because he wanted to say thank you. Returning home, he found Kushinada preparing something in the corner of the porch. A small package, wrapped in red cloth. She didn't explain. She just handed it to him. When you feel the need, open it. He didn't open it. Saved, the day was slowly ending. The sky now had shades of copper and gray. The light leaked through the cracks, like diluted ink. They had dinner in silence. Strong tea, seasoned rice, little salt. Then, they sat on the large rock for the last time that season. The cold no longer allowed for their daily habit. But that night, they insisted. Susanoo looked up at the sky. The constellation of the serpent was no longer visible. It was the time of the quiet stars, the ones that shine little but never disappear. He pointed to one. That one over there. See? Kushinada followed his finger. Yes, it looks still. It always reminds me of you. She laughed, but she didn't take back the compliment. And that one over there? She asked, pointing to another one. That is me when I forget that I can stop. They stared for a while. The entire sky was a mirror now, a reflection of the calm that can only be achieved after much noise. They went back inside. The house was warm. The stove was still lit. The blankets were folded. Everything was in its place. Nothing too much. Nothing too little. Before going to sleep, Susanoo opened the package that Kushinada had given him. Inside, a cloth embroidered with the phases of the moon, each one marked with a different colored dot, and in the center, a dark circle, empty, no embroidery, just the bare fabric. She came closer. This is the space of what has not yet been lived. He ran his fingers over the void. What if there is nothing left to live for? She replied, almost in a whisper. Then it becomes rest. That night, they slept deeper than ever. Not like someone fleeing, but like someone landing. The house was quieter than ever. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was another kind, a silence filled, like a cup filled to the brim, where no sound dared to fall. Kushinada woke before the sun. His body was still warm under the blankets, but his mind was already awake. He got up carefully. He put water on the fire. He stirred the herbs slowly. He didn't make a sound, not for fear of waking him, but out of respect for what that morning held. A kind of wordless reverence. Susanoo was still asleep. His face was serene. His hands were open, as if he was finally resting not only his body, but also what was inside him. Kushinada watched for a moment. Then he went back to his routine. He made tea. He folded the night clothes. He opened the window. The cold came in gently. The light still hadn't. Outside, everything seemed suspended. The trees did not move. The stream ran, but without sound. The birds, if any, were silent. It was as if the world had decided to wait with her. There was no urgency, no fear, just a different rhythm. When Susanoo woke up, his eyes took longer to open. It took his body time to accept the movement. But he was calm. He smiled when he saw her. She smiled back. Did I sleep a lot? You got all the sleep you needed, she replied. They drank tea together. They ate almost nothing, just dried fruit and a little rice. Then they sat on the porch, each with his own blanket. The sky was cloudy, but not overcast, a soft gray, not threatening rain, only offering shade. It was the kind of day that didn't require decisions. Susanoo looked at the field. His eyes scanned it like someone reading a familiar text, but always finding something new. The field was calm, the plants were at rest, the stones were in place. The tree was firm, everything was where it should be. He took a deep breath, and in that cold air, he felt an entire memory dissolve. Not because you were gone, but because you no longer needed to be carried. I think I'm starting to get light, he said. Kushinada did not respond immediately. Then he said, maybe it's time to not take anything anymore. The day passed without haste. They washed their hands in the stream. They gathered some dry leaves. They lit the fire early. The crackling of the wood was the only living sound in the house, and yet it sounded as if it were respecting the pause. In the afternoon, Susanoo sat at the table with a sheet of paper and some old ink. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a ticket. It was a symbol, an open circle at the bottom, unfinished, like the cycle of the moon on the cloth Kushinada had given her. When she was finished, she let it dry and hung it above the shelf. She didn't explain, but she understood. At dusk, the sky opened up. The clouds gave way to a handful of stars, and then, like a wave, the moon appeared. Thin, discreet, almost a line, but present. The two sat on the rock for the last time in that cycle. The blanket divided, their hands intertwined. The cold was now part of the scene. It didn't threaten. It just reminded them. Do you feel like you accomplished what you needed to? Kushinada asked, without looking. Susanoo took a moment. Then he said, I don't know what I needed, but I know what was possible. And it was good. She squeezed his hand lightly. Then there's nothing missing. They stayed there until night fell. Then they went back inside. The house was dark. The fire was low. The shadows were long. It was so still that the world seemed to have stopped. Before going to sleep, Susanoo walked around the house. He ran his hand over the shelves. He looked at the objects, the small sculpture, the dried nest, the embroidered cloth. Everything was still there. Everything was peaceful. When he lay down, he sighed. He closed his eyes. He didn't say goodnight. He didn't even need to. Kushinada lay down next to him. She placed her hand on his chest. She felt his slow breathing, his steady heart, the exact temperature of now. The night went on, as if time had stopped just to watch. The next day didn't start with sunshine. It didn't start with wind either. It was just soft light coming in through the cracks in the window, an almost timid brightness, as if asking for permission. Kushinada woke up with his eyes already open, not because he hadn't slept, but because sleep that night was different, deeper, more silent. He sat on the edge of the bed. He touched the floor with his bare feet. The cold crept up his legs, but it didn't bother him. It was just a warning that there was still the world outside. He looked to the side. Susanoo was sleeping. His face was serene. His breathing was so light that it blended in with the silence of the house. She didn't call him. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. There was no rush, no duty, just presence. And that was the only thing that mattered. He got up. He lit the fire. He put water on to boil. He stirred the herbs. He prepared the tea with the same gestures as always. The kitchen smelled of memory. The steam rose like a thread between worlds. He placed the cups on the table. He waited, but he didn't wait. Time passed. Morning slowly entered the house. It touched the walls, the objects, the shelves. Everything was in its place. Nothing was out of order. The symbol that Susanoo had hung the day before swayed slightly, almost imperceptibly. The ink was dry, the paper firm. An unfinished line, like him. When she returned to the room, Susanoo was still asleep, but the silence was different now. It wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, fuller. The breathing had stopped, but not with fright, nor with pain. It had simply stopped, like a wave that reaches the sand, spreads, and disappears. Kushinada came closer, touched his hand, still warm, no stiffness, no tension. It was as if he were still there, and maybe he was. She sat beside him. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She stayed with him for long hours, in silence, sometimes speaking softly, things that only he would understand, things that perhaps she herself didn't know she needed to say. Outside, the afternoon arrived without sound. The birds sang softly. The wind moved the leaves carefully. The whole world seemed to know and respected. When the sun began to set, she went out into the field. She went to the big tree, the same one that had sheltered him through so many rain. She leaned against it. She took a small box. Inside, pieces of his life with him, the dry nest, the embroidered cloth, an old note. She buried everything with her hands, without ceremony, just a gesture, just gratitude. She returned home. She lit the fire. She prepared rice, strong tea. She sat at the table. She ate slowly, as always, not out of habit, but out of continuity, because being alive was still a task. That night, she lay alone, but not alone. The whole house seemed to breathe with her. The air, the wood, the heat from the stove. Everything seemed to say, he had been here, and he still is. The symbol on the wall still hung, light, unanswered, and perhaps it never would. Outside, the sky was clear, the moon was thin, the kind of night when the world rests without fear. And so, without haste, without an abrupt end, the story of Susanoo lay down with time, not as a legend, nor as a goodbye, but as a cycle that understands when it is time to be silent. If you've made it this far, I hope you found rest in this journey. If you want to come back, I'll be here, at the same pace, at the same calm, and if all this has done you good, you can sign up only if you want to. Good night and sweet dreams.